All right, welcome everyone. We are at the panel that's focusing on today's cutting edge Web3 and DeFi solutions with some amazing panelists here. We have Joe Lubin, he's the founder of ConsenSys, Rune Christensen, the founder of MakerDAO, and Jaime Burke, the founder of Outlier Ventures. Thank you so much for being here in this panel and sharing your interesting thoughts. So to start off, I want to get just everyone on the same page on what Web3 actually is. So I'm really interested in how you're seeing this space and how it's different from Web2. Joe, why don't you start?
Sure, thanks, Camila. So I think the salient characteristic of Web3 that is going to profoundly distinguish it from Web2 and make it exciting as a new IT infrastructure for the planet is the nature of how trust is treated, how new decentralized protocols, if they're sufficiently decentralized, they should be able to imbue transactions with trust. They should be able to serve as essentially a new automated objective trust foundation that will enable us to move beyond the centralized subjective structures that have in the past been responsible for conferring or imbuing the trust characteristic to different kinds of systems and transactions, etc. And so based on that new trust foundation, we are going to be able to do things like trusted collaboration and issue digital assets. And so we're seeing early stages of all of that play out. Upon a new trust foundation, if it's sufficiently decentralized, as currently two platforms, Bitcoin and Ethereum, are sufficiently decentralized for our purposes right now. It's still a small ecosystem, and they would have to be much more decentralized across lots of different dimensions that we have identified, and probably others that we will identify over time. So upon those two platforms, we're starting to see the development of a new financial plumbing infrastructure for the planet. It's you can call it decentralized finance, but there's also centralized finance that's being built on this new trust infrastructure. DeFi, stick to the topic of the panel, DeFi is just a profound innovation that's going to democratize this important foundational layer of global society. And maybe we'll just talk about that later on in this session, and I can move to just the other pieces of Web3. So on this base trust layer, we have a global digital asset settlement layer taking form, and that's going to be infrastructure that's going to enable us to build so much, to essentially re-architect all the systems of the world. Financial, economic, social, political. So we'll see lots of that, and they will be realized using lots of different decentralized protocols, interoperating decentralized protocols. So it's not just protocols for automating transactions, guaranteeing execution of agreements. It's protocols for decentralized storage. It's protocols for decentralized bandwidth and decentralized heavy compute, provisioning for your needs, paying for your needs with tokens. It's protocols for decentralized identity and verifiable credentials so that you can make cryptographic assertions about certain characteristics, and decentralized proof of location, etc. So all of these increasingly interoperating protocols will be added to the soup of different Web2 protocols that enable us to build now. And Web3 will, similar to how Web 2 was an evolution of Web 1, bring interactivity and e-commerce and a whole bunch of other elements that transformed life on planet Earth. Web 3 will do the same, essentially bring a new trust foundation and a new internet of value.
That's an exciting vision, which, you know, means that our whole economy, like every piece of the applications and services that we're used to interacting with, will change, and with the core feature of shifting trust from centralized parties to more decentralized entities. Jaime or Rune, do you agree with this vision? Who wants to follow Joe's description? Jaime, why don't you go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so to maybe just build on what Joe said, I think if I were to simplify it down, we are talking about a shift towards user or user citizen centricity, a web that is predicated on the user, versus if you look at the current paradigm in Web 2, which is oriented towards the platform, and within that really shareholder supremacy. And you can see the conflicts that start to arise there between the user and the shareholder. I think Web3 has the promise to better align the economics and value around the user versus these other actors. Again, I think kind of building on that concept of trust, if you think about the cost of trust, the friction that exists both in the real world, but of course, even still now online, this promises to remove a lot of that friction, and therefore the consequence hopefully is that there will be kind of a greater amount of economic activity, cost savings and everything else. But really, it's not that we're going to remove agents entirely from these systems, but it's just that they'll become verifiable, or at least those that are verifiable, greater value will kind of flow to them. And if you look at that in the context of how the world is currently organized, you know, we have these things called brands, and those brands make promises, and that's ultimately how we currently trust the organizations that we deal with. But of course, the rules of the game can and often are changed if they're even transparent at all. And I think here, the rules, you know, are hard-coded, they can be verified. And so that fundamentally changes the dynamic, and it will allow users to opt in or out at any point. So that kind of portability of trust and reputation. But I think, and that will allow a number of things to happen. So, of course, there is these digital assets that we kind of see now that might be a store of value or a currency. But again, as Joe was alluding to, I think there is this possibility to turn intangibles in our life. So, you know, capacity, excess bandwidth, like whatever it is that currently is an intangible, it's not quantifiable, we pay for it, we don't fully optimize it. There is the potential to begin to quantify that, to commodify it and trade it. And if you then introduce, so effectively that is turning everything into data and into a form of digital asset. And then of course, you know, that is fed into machine learning. So we've long advocated or understood that central to Web3 is actually the convergence of things like blockchain, IoT, and AI, machine learning. It has the potential to lead to a world which can be better quantified, better optimized, and of course, that's increasingly important if we look at things like, you know, carbon footprint and everything else. So for us at the center of all this, it's about a new data economy.
I love that vision of a world where intangibles can be traded and turned into data, and that just opens up so many use cases that just aren't possible in the current infrastructure. Also, this idea of openness and having a more transparent system that's verifiable by users, and having and giving users more freedom and more options to opt out of a system or of a company, which right now we're kind of slaves in some ways to the large corporations that make up the internet. Rune, what do you think?
Yeah, I think most of it's already been said for sure, and I mean I completely agree with Joe's and Jamie's points about all the different ramifications of Web3. I mean, so the way I think of it myself is that just like Web2 was about, like the big paradigm shift was this thing about user-generated content and sort of the, more interactivity between people online. And I think Web3 is also like Jamie said, right? It's all about empowering the user and really making the internet user-centric. And specifically I see this, it's about ownership and autonomy and really sovereignty of the user's identity, of the access and the connections that you have as a user. So basically it means that instead of Facebook and Google and the big companies running the internet, it's the users that run the internet together, peer-to-peer, right? And instead of the banks deciding how people transact and use the value, it's the people themselves that decide how they transact and use the value amongst each other. And so just ultimately it's about, users getting more power, and through that getting more options and more, opportunities essentially. And that's how all of these things like IoT and tokenization and all this stuff really manifest itself. It simply is because with more access and more power as a user, you can just do so many more interesting things without having to first go through some sort of central, legal system that has to figure out how to deal with it, or some bank that doesn't know how to code it, and so on, right? It really is so much easier for people to just interact directly.
So let me jump in there.
Yes.
All of this sounds so right and great. And the question is, these systems sound really wonderful with different necessary characteristics, but is that enough to actually make it happen? So Jamie said something that I think was really important. Then the foundation of society is trust. We can't do anything together really unless we trust each other to some degree. And Jamie's point was these technologies bring the cost of trust way down. And so the reason why all of this is going to end up being the way life on Earth, systems on Earth are architected, is simply the total cost of all these systems, the total cost of ownership, the total cost of a set of transactions, or maintaining a relationship, or interacting with your consortium on a protocol is going to drop massively. And so it's going to be economics that usher in this transformation.
I think that's a really important point, because in the end, I don't think big shifts, foundational shifts like the ones that we're talking about, happen based on just like nice ideas, like, oh, it'll be nice to have decentralization and openness and transparency. You needed to actually make economic sense for people to shift into these new protocols. So I think that's is a very kind of optimistic. It makes me optimistic about this actually turning out the way that you're all saying. The fact that it is actually it makes economic sense to do it.
Ultimately, the bean counters will define the next architecture for the planet. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd also say, just to kind of build on that,
yeah.
Before we move on to the next point, that like whilst we were all presenting a particular end of the spectrum, that, it isn't binary. I think there are instances of Web3 that will be very different. If you look at the Chinese Asian model, really what you're looking at is an interplay of sovereignties. And so, yes, we're creating technology that creates a user-centric sovereignty, or self-sovereign custody and ownership of data and assets. But that will still have to interplay with national sovereignties, with corporate sovereignties. So I don't think it's that the world gets totally replaced. But again, Joe's point, economic value will flow to the point of least resistance, of least friction. And so I believe long term that more value will flow to this alternative, perhaps more extreme decentralized internet than it will these other sovereignties, but it doesn't mean that they get replaced entirely.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a more kind of realistic take as well. And so, okay, so we're talking about what this new web will look like or should look like, but what about what's actually happening right now? And what I see is that decentralized finance has really taken off. It recently, the assets locked in these platforms recently crossed 2 billion. Tokens are surging. There's different estimates that say around 100,000 to 200,000 users are in this ecosystem. So there's huge growth by almost any metric. And it looks like this is the area that's making the biggest strides towards this Web3 new paradigm. Want to ask whether you agree with that statement? I mean, is like the financial use case taking the lead? And like what in DeFi do you see is most exciting to you right now? So maybe Rune can start, since he's the founder of DAI, which is kind of the backbone of this ecosystem.
Sure. So I definitely think that I agree that DeFi is really what's taking off to some extent of Web3, right? And it's the beginning of seeing all of these like all of this potential, all of this interplay of the new technologies actually make a real difference and be used by people at scale. And I think the reason why it is DeFi that's happening first of the Web3 vision, even though, in the early days of Ethereum, for instance, it certainly was not a given at all that it would be finance or be the big thing. It was really like, there's so many different paths this could take. I think in hindsight, the reason is that finance is just a low-hanging fruit for Web3 to really disrupt, because if you look at how legacy finance, or, the legacy financial system is structured, it's just so based on this model of restricting access, of controlling identity, controlling access, controlling connection, and so on, right? And you have situations where there are tons of people that don't have access to the US dollar, for instance, and then if they can get that through DeFi, through DAI, for instance, that just becomes an immensely popular product. Just something as simple as that, having access to the US dollar. Or maybe even more powerfully, what we're seeing currently really, what has exploded in the last year or so is this idea of being able to get returns, right? So actually being able to invest without any barriers to entry. So even if you're based in, countries in South America or Africa or Southeast Asia or something like that, which is something that we in Maker always been focused a lot on, that there's a lot of people that are basically completely cut off from the global financial system in some places. And the fact that you can then give them that access through their mobile phone, that actually is it's very powerful, and it also just, because of that value, it has shown itself to become, at least the beginnings of popularity. But all in all, I still think it's important to recognize that DeFi actually still is, it's just in the very, very early days.
Sure.
And one of my favorite quotes that I can't remember who made it, but it's that the total users of DeFi right now is still pretty much equivalent to that of an indie computer game. So it's not really like a global thing just yet, right? It's actually still a pretty small ecosystem. It just has immense value because it's finance. It's not, you know, computer games, right? It's actually the most powerful type of system that exists, right? So even with this modest user base that exists right now, the value is still just so immense. And the next step is going to be, I think, like the connection into the real world, when we actually start to see things like tokenization of real world assets. That's what in Maker we are really focused on. Is like, that's the next big step. That's when things really get real. And also just like better user experience that can bring it out properly to regular people at a greater scale.
Yeah, it was kind of the low-hanging fruit because the current system just works so poorly, I guess, and it's bringing incredible value even at this very early stage. Joe, do you want to add on to what Rune said? Do you think DeFi is actually what's bringing Web3 forward?
Yeah, absolutely. At this point, so I think it's fair to say that DeFi is low-hanging fruit at this point, but it's only low-hanging fruit because of a set of enablements that have happened over the years. And so we can look all the way back 10 years, essentially. So the first use case was cryptocurrency, and that was low-hanging fruit for a few people and really valuable for certain people around the world, including at least one person on this particular panel, the moderator. I know that cryptocurrencies had effect in your life in a certain political context. And as we developed more and more innovation, so 5 years into it, we have a platform developed that enables smart contracts, guaranteed execution, essentially. And a whole lot of activity happened around that, a lot of experimental activity. People were creating their own coins. People were creating their decentralized organizations. We got out a little ahead of ourselves, I think, because we didn't have the prudent thinking and structures in place for potentially good governance. And when things like ERC20 standards and other fungible token standards and non-fungible token standards developed, that basically gave us a shared language on which we could build the next evolution. So we started issuing tokens for different projects. We started issuing tokens knowing that exchanges would recognize them, knowing that wallets would recognize them. Fast forward to building different governance systems, and essentially we've gotten to a point where things like price stable tokens, DAI and others have enabled yield to come into the picture. Yield has enabled more decentralized financial protocols. And so it's a pretty logical progression, I think. And this stage, decentralized financial protocols, where we've democratized, or early stages of democratizing finance, taking the power out of the hands of the financial priests, access to the financial gods of money and interest and equities and bond issuance, and giving control of the full life cycle of a digital asset to anybody who wants to learn enough to take control and to make good use of that. That's an incredibly empowering situation that we find ourselves in, and it's going to be enabling of the next set of innovations. So I think we'll see the DeFi ecosystem just expand enormously quickly. We'll see things that we couldn't contemplate before in traditional finance. Flash loans are a simple example, but one can imagine bots that just scour the decentralized universe, running around securitizing things. So it will be a fascinating world to imagine, and the foundation. It really has to be that decentralized finance plumbing, and it's going to draw in so many new business models. We're seeing that already, and it's going to bring in a lot of legacy businesses to reimagine how they offer their wares to their clients.
I love this kind of idea of having completely crazy use cases emerge from this, like bots securitizing stuff around the world. And I also kind of like this progression of how different financial use cases on Ethereum have emerged from cryptocurrencies to fundraising to stablecoins to now yield or lending out those stablecoins to get yield. Jaime, what do you think? Just to lead off from what Joe said, what do you think is the next logical progression in DeFi from what's happened so far?
Yes, I mean, again, I'd agree that a lot of it feels like a natural progression. So if you speak to a VC, for example, who's not of Web3, it's just blockchain might be one thing that they'd look at. They'll generally think it's all fintech. So this distinction of DeFi to them doesn't really make that much sense. They regard it entirely as fintech. And actually, if you look at what we've witnessed or are witnessing, is this bottom-up formation of an alternative financial system that's native to the internet. So, if you look at how capital markets have formed before, modern capital markets sequentially, probably going to follow the same path. As Joe said, there'll be new and different things that emerge, but there'll also be a lot of similar things that are just replicated by smart contracts or anything else. And so I guess, calling it DeFi now is making the distinction that some of that innovation is being productized in a way that could be understood as financial services and potentially used in the same way. I think it's a natural consequence that you start at high value transactions, high value assets, and then over time you might apply the same infrastructure. If you think about public key infrastructure and all these innovations that are currently used to secure high value assets, over time that same infrastructure could be used to secure intangibles or low value assets like your data, your personal data, which is very difficult to even price right now. I think if you look at how the industry is evolving, and again, to kind of riff a little bit off what Joe was saying about the level of autonomy that might begin to exist in these systems, it's one of the reasons why we invested in a project called Fetch. They're really AI machine learning people. And I think once you start to combine this kind of composable AI Lego with money Lego, I think it gets really interesting. But if we look at today, the startups that we're seeing go through or apply for Accelerator, a lot of them are focused on things like data. So of course, with the success of Chainlink and Oracle's, this focus on the data that comes into the system from the real world, the quality of that data, because the system can only be as good as the data that's being fed into it. So we've got projects like Dear Data, for example, that are focused on bringing a higher quality of data that is like compliant, whereby institutional product could be built, like indices, for example, that can begin to attract more institutional money in. And I think if you look at some of the products, whilst we're starting to see improvements in UX and usability, things like Dharma and what have you, they're still they still don't give a full picture on the risk that's inherent into the system, whether that's smart contract dependencies, economic relationships between multiple protocols. So there is a huge amount of information asymmetry. And therefore, if we look at this as a speculative system, what that means is you're going to have people coming in, and you can look at what's happening with TikTok now and the whole Dogecoin thing. There's definitely going to be a new wave of retail investor that's coming in and has no chance at all of understanding the complexities of the system. The products that they're using will only kind of be relevant for one protocol when you might have several performing specialist functions. So I think we're starting to see a lot of different startups looking to try to address, reduce these asymmetries at a product level, but then also from a kind of security perspective as well. So I think that usability of money Lego is a nice concept, but how that actually translates into, you know, products that anybody could use, a retail user could use, I think was still some way off.
Right.
So I think Jamie's point about autonomy can't be overemphasized. I feel like we are entering a new economic age. Often I call it the age of automated and objective trust, but you could also think of it as the age of automated autonomy. And so we, in our systems, are building digitization, we're building standardization so we can all work together more fluidly. More recently, we're building tokenization so we can tokenize all the things and bring digitization and standardization to all the things. And automation is all part of that. And the really interesting element, the element that is going to be the competitive advantage for entities that jump into the Web3 technology and ecosystem earlier is the fact that there are autonomous elements out there that run by themselves, that work by themselves, that make hopefully the best choices, and that you can run your own startup, your own entity, and focus on your core competency, and you can outsource to these incredibly smart, capable, automated systems that can basically, so we, and Jamie has been tracking AI for a really long time. I've been tracking it for decades, and for so long we've heard about these intelligent agents that are coming around the corner, and so many people have been doing research, but we didn't really have the platform on which intelligent agents could actually have any sort of effect or their own agency. And so we now do. We can have autonomous agents, and soon we'll have autonomous intelligent agents that can do our own bidding in lots of ways. And so the corporations of the future that string together a whole bunch of these things are going to be operating 1,000 times faster and better than everybody else.
And I think just to close off on that point, because it's a really interesting one, this is why I believe user-centricity is so important, because previously, if you look at machine learning, it's largely to serve a platform, and you know, we're just the training data. When you have a web that is oriented towards user sovereignty, these agents work on behalf of the user, and you can trust them to do so, and not an alternative stakeholder like a platform and its shareholders.
I'd love to get some, like, take this idea and like really make it concrete for people listening. So this idea of agents working for like self-sovereign users, like what does it exactly look like for, you know, everyday people? Like how will this become a product? Like how, yeah, like in what ways will it impact every day?
Can be as simple as you training up an AI to understand your taste in shoes, and the AI is just constantly scouring the internet and perhaps other resources to identify styles that it thinks you might want to be aware of, and it would know your pricing preferences. It might place bids for you. You might give it parameters to enable it to act under its own agency. So very simple example. In DeFi, you can imagine something that just is fairly simple, not very intelligent, but just gets you the best yield at all moments.
Right. So I guess like the difference with Web 2 in this case would be the execution, because I think right now, like we have like some machine learning that can recommend like different movies or shoes or whatever. But I think there's like this lack of like executing for me according to like presets that I give the robot.
Yeah, so I think two pieces that enable it are one, that these bots would be realized as software on your phone, but also smart contracts on the blockchain, and they would have access to money. They would have control over the ability to spend money on your behalf. And they would be unstoppable execution machines. So if written correctly, they interact with your user interface, and nobody's going to be able to thwart them in bidding for what you asked them to bid.
Right. And I think an interesting element here is that like shoes or assets could very well be tokens, and I can be buying a fraction of like a very like exclusive piece of, I don't know, like limited edition sneaker or something like that. Like we've already seen happening. Yeah,
I think it wants further. I mean, imagine you have a hotel room and it has its own agent, and it optimizes its capacity or its yield, its pricing. So you end up with a marketplace of agents that could represent a person, a group of people, a thing, and the agents interact with one another to optimize, find price discovery. It's a kind of a form of collective intelligence, each optimizing for its owner.
No, it's a crazy new world to imagine. And just to wrap up, I think we're right about on time. We talked about all these amazing ideas for the future, but for this year, what do you guys think will be kind of the major development, either in DeFi or Web3 in general? And yeah, if you can just keep it brief, and then we can wrap up with that. Yeah, whoever wants to start.
I think that something I think we pointed to right now is this rediscovery of tokenomics and what's happening with DeFi tokens, right? Where you're seeing strategies to create this viral interest in new projects by giving out free tokens, basically through some sort of like direct engagement or usage of the system. Which I think is it's a really cool use of the power of DeFi and the power of blockchain. But in my opinion, it's kind of like what the really big step that is going to come after this is we start to get this increased engagement, this understanding of the power where you can give some tokens and you can build a huge user base. Is really that what's still missing from DeFi right now in 2020 is this. It's a term that actually comes from within DeFi, right? It's the concept of economic bandwidth. So basically, sort of I would say the capital or the collateral equivalent of scaling. Basically, and this comes back to the whole concept of like the fact that the community is still pretty small, right? That it's also very self-referential, you could say, right? It's kind of, in fact, it's kind of like a little bubble, right? Where everything is sort of interacting with itself within DeFi. But what's missing and what's going to be such a huge breakthrough is when you start to be able to sort of pop this bubble, right? And break through the membrane and actually get this more seamless integration of the really cool stuff that's being built within DeFi today. And then, all the companies out there, the financial markets out there that are looking for some sort of technical innovation to improve their, their products and services and rates and so on. And once that happens, that's when you also really that's when you can get the scale, you can get the extra legitimacy into DeFi, where then, I think that once that starts to happen, that's when I think a much broader group of people will finally be interested to think, okay, when Joe Lubin is talking and Jaime, when they're talking about autonomous agents and so on, it's actually real. Like it's actually going to happen because I can see this, can see how it's starting to integrate everywhere, and I think we're right on the cusp of that actually beginning to happen.
Yeah. Joe, do you wanna go for
Sure.
this year's development?
Sure. So I feel like DeFi is certainly going to be the next major explosion. And DeFi is an enabling element along with zero knowledge proofs for another wave of adoption that I believe will sweep a lot of enterprise into the Web3 ecosystem. And we don't need the scalability of layer 2 on top of Ethereum 1 or even Ethereum 2 in order to enable a lot of that. So Ernst & Young and ConsenSys have created a set of techniques, built a protocol called the Baseline Protocol that enables organizations to sync up their agreements, to sync up their business processes, and demonstrate that they are in lockstep via zero knowledge proofs on Ethereum. And so multiple counterparties can enter into agreements, business relationships, transactions, leaving all of the sensitive data on their side of the firewall in their systems of record. These can be traditional databases or blockchains or whatever, and link all those together in a global frame of reference, the Ethereum mainnet, via zero knowledge proof. So no sensitive information is leaked, and essentially organizations can do things that they couldn't really do before. Where, if you get pricing for some element that you're procuring, generally that set of promises doesn't follow through. The vendor will have the vendor's agenda and the buyer will have the buyer's agenda, and there's no automated way at this point to guarantee that all these agreements proceed properly. Baseline Protocol is bringing in currently hundreds of organizations. We've demonstrated that SAP can be linked up to Microsoft Dynamics. Microsoft Dynamics can be linked up to Google Sheets, and we've got a whole bunch more demonstrations. All of this sits on top of DeFi. So we can, using price stable tokens, we can tokenize inventory, we can tokenize invoices, we can factor invoices. Enterprise is not only going to start using public mainnet Ethereum to link up their traditional business processes, but they're going to start to experiment with DeFi to finance.
Super interesting. So
do other elements.
So both Rune and Joe talked about different ways of piercing this self-referential DeFi bubble and bringing in the outside world. Jaime, what do you think to finish up?
So I'm actually really excited about 2020, despite perhaps because of everything else that's going on in a broader kind of macroeconomic sense. So on the one hand, I think we've got this maturing Web3 stack, thanks to a lot of the good work that people on this panel have been doing over the years. And we're starting to see a lot of middleware form around it that's making it usable. When people think of adoption, they usually think of end users, consumers. Actually, the kind of first batch of people that need to be onboarded are 99% of developers. There's a lot of interesting middleware that's coming through that's making this stuff easy to use, to deploy. And then at the same time, I think we're going to have some breakthroughs in seemingly simple technology that are beginning to form standards. So the DID standard around decentralized identifiers and effectively identity. You can have verifiable claims. You can verify things about people, organizations in a zero knowledge proof environment is a huge innovation. And at the moment is that solving for decentralized identity is something that's actually really holding back the decentralized web. But what I'm excited for is what's broadly going on in the world, which I think is going to accelerate adoption, like the demand side, with everything that's going on with COVID now and how nations are responding with monetary policy and stimulus. I think this is going to increasingly drive capital into the asset class. And with the advent of DeFi and things like stable coins and ways of removing a lot of the volatility, that's going to be easier to do. I think if you look at this generational shift, it feels like there is a generation that is now native to Web3 in a way that none of us probably on this panel are. And with high levels of youth unemployment, probably a permanent shift to a digital gig economy that people just aren't going to have jobs anymore. In combination with this explosion in gaming and virtual goods, you know, you could imagine that there is a generation that is only ever going to know digital wealth. And the fact we've now got crypto debit cards means that they will be able to spend that wealth in the real world. And then lastly, we're beginning to start to have Web3 gateways like Brave browser. You know, people are using Brave because it's a better browser, not necessarily because it's got anything to do with blockchain. It's abstracted that complexity away, but it is introducing a wider population to tokenization, to DeFi in browser. And I think, you know, that perfect storm of things, as well as this maturing stack, promises, it really feels like the beginning of something, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. It does feel like we're in the cusp of this thing, you know, getting even bigger and more interesting with, you know, new players like Joe mentioned, enterprises, new assets like Rune mentioned, and more capital, more people coming into the ecosystem. It'll be such an interesting year to watch. And thank you all for discussing this with me. This has been a really fun and interesting conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.